Okay, that's it for the social media bits. So we just wait a couple more minutes before we get started. Just realized I left this on. I don't need this. Just put that to the side for now. Because what am I doing before a reading stream? Of course, I'm just jamming out to music and doing other stuff. I jam out to a lot of music before I actually stream, which I know is like one of those things that like that seems counterintuitive when you're like reading up your notes, for example, just before I do my reading stream. I'm just reviewing a couple of my notes, and I'm also just jamming out to loud music at the same time, which is not how you do devotionals. I mean, I don't know if reading going over like my Bible stream notes counts as a devotional. It doesn't, because I also do my devotion in the morning, and there's that too. But when I'm doing review for these Bible reading streams, I'm actually just jamming out to music before, so that's why I still had my headset on. So that I know hashtag terrible pastor, right? But anyway, hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the book of Luke, and today I have learned my lesson after reviewing the last couple, the first 2 weeks of reading through Luke, and I was like, okay, I am not going to try and be ambitious. We are going to take it way slower. Only do 2 chapters. I don't mind having it be a shorter stream, but we'll only do 2 chapters each week. So, but if that's the case, I mean, the book of Luke will take us all the way till like April at this rate, but that's okay. I don't mind only doing like, I just like remapped how I would actually do the Bible reading streams. And maybe this year we only do 3 books. I'm thinking we just do Luke, Acts, and Romans and just take them all slower. And that's totally fine too. It's one of those things that like, I mean, because we only do this once a week. So you think like, oh, reading the Bible cover to cover. I mean, the Bible itself is not like a huge book, right? I mean, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is a longer book, technically, than reading the Bible. Not quite, but it's up there. It's up there, right? And some people read like the Lord of the Rings trilogy in like a weekend, maybe a week span. Like yours truly, right? You're one of those nerds. You just think like that nerd sitting with this hot cocoa reading Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yeah, that's yours truly in a nutshell, right? And so, in the grand scheme of things, like reading through the Bible actually doesn't take you very long. But to actually study it, and to study book by book, and doing it in the stream format, of course, it would be way slower. So, like when I say, "Oh, we're just gonna do 3 books in 2022 at this rate," like 3 books is not that many. But on the one hand, like 2 of those books, Luke and Acts, are both extremely long compared to other Bible books. So there's that. And then secondly, since they're so rich in content, there's just so much to talk about. I mean, I have seen some pastors spend an entire year of sermons on one book. And so for us to do like 3, like last year I did 5 books, which was super ambitious. This year we might only get 3. But even that's pretty ambitious in comparison. So when I say like, oh, we're just going to read like Luke, Acts, and Romans in 2022, wow, that's still a lot. And so going back to the original point I was getting at before I mentioned all that, today we're only going to read 2 chapters, and it looks like that's going to be how it is for the next while, because the book of Luke, 1 chapter we could easily spend like an entire stream on 1 chapter. But I mean, I am able to do more than 1 chapter in a 2.5 hour stream, so that's how we're gonna do things. So today we'll be reading through Luke 6 and 7 today. I'll be reading through the New International Version. I encourage you to follow along. Use a Bible app or your desktop is like BibleGateway.com. Just get a free Bible online. It's totally cool, right? I'm not one of those like sticklers. I was like, you must have a physical copy. Using online copy is perfectly fine, right? I mean, as long as the Word of God is out there, that's what's important. How the Word of God gets out there, I couldn't care less. I couldn't care less. Before we start, we'll just start with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin our Luke reading today. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word in the book of Luke. And I just pray that as we read through Luke, you would teach us much of your intentions for our lives and how we ought to live. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so just a quick review from last week and a little bit of the week before. So we have covered most of the early life. We've covered the early life of Jesus, and we've covered a little bit of the beginning of his ministry. And of course, the beginning of his ministry, Jesus starts out with a bang because he's basically making big statements. He's doing stuff that the people in Israel had never seen. And when the people start seeing this, they're like, is this guy the Messiah? Because they already had a lot of powerful teaching and ministry through John the Baptist. But then Jesus shows up and he's doing way more. And the people are wondering, is this the beginning of that promise of the Messiah that in the Old Testament had been giving for a long time, since the book of Exodus, really. But the book of Exodus was a lot more subtle. And then as we go through, as I talked about in the book of Samuel, and not a little bit in the book of Kings, there were subtle bits here and there about the Messiah. But a lot of the Messiah talk didn't become a lot more proactive in people's thinking until after the Babylonian exile, which would have been like 400-ish BC, 500-ish BC. Somewhere in that range, right? The 400 something. But I think it was in the earlier parts, 470, I think is the magic number, BC. And it was around that time period, and of course, I skipped over this book. I didn't read it on stream. And I don't expect you to read through this entirety of Ezra and Nehemiah, at least not without some help, because I get that those books can be a little bit mentally draining to read, just to read on your own. Especially if you're not someone who's familiar with reading the Bible often. But as you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, and they compiled the scriptures, and they were a lot more conscious about the prophecies of the Messiah. And of course, that's where, if you were reading the Bible from cover to cover kind of thing, you would then run into the prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, and so on. And they talk much more about the Messiah, even though Isaiah was before the exile. But the prophetic books talk way more about the Messiah than, say, the historical books like Samuel and Kings. And Exodus, of course. And so now we jump to the book of Luke, and the people see Jesus doing miracles, and they're thinking is this it? Is this the age of the Messiah? Of course, we'll cover some Jewish ideologies of how they interpreted how the Messiah would be based on other scriptures and whatnot. But of course, spoilers for a 2,000-year book, Jesus subverts a lot of the expectations of the Messiah. But we'll cover that much later when it's relevant. But right now, for the sake of reading chapter 6 and 7, with Jesus doing some of the stuff he does, and of course in chapter 5, what was interesting is Jesus also was kind of bumping around with certain social taboos. And this brought into the question of, well, is the why would it, if Jesus were the Messiah, why would he be, pushing the boundaries with these taboos? And so that's a very important end note that we ended on in chapter 5 when we were reading chapter 5, because that continues on in chapter 6 and chapter 7, which is what we will be reading today. So here we go, chapter 6. So one Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. And some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took the consecrated bread. He ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisee and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So the man got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to the crowds, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" Jesus looked around at them, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." The man did so, and his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to him. Now one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. First we have Simon, who he named Peter, Simon's brother Andrew, James and John, Bartholomew, sorry, there was a comma there. His name is not Philip Bartholomew, they're two different guys here. Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, not this James, but a different James. I guess his name would be Jameson. We'll call him Judas Jameson. And Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now Jesus went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples were there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him, because power was coming from him and healing them all. Looking at his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. And blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude and insult you, and reject your name as evil, because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in this day, and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. And woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. And woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. But to you who are listening, I say, Love your enemies, and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them done to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is it to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Because even sinners can do that. And if you lend to those whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies and do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be the children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Now do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Jesus also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. For why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye," when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings up evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So then why? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. For they are like a man building a house who dug deep into the land of the foundation of rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. Just getting rid of the bot. And let's talk about Luke 6. So Luke 6 is the Luke version, at least part of it, because there's, well, a whole bunch more in, if you're reading the Matthew account of the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, the Matthew account covers it in like 3 chapters. The book of Luke only does 1. And of course, the other thing too that the book of Matthew does, it puts everything that a lot of Jesus' teachings into a single Sermon on the Mount. Whereas the book of Luke will have other parts of the Sermon on the Mount in later parts, and we'll cover that when we get to them. But basically, in Luke 6, we have a lot of teaching from Jesus. But before that, we have kind of the ending part of chapter 5, which I guess begs the question of when the translator was putting this together. Why didn't he just move the beginning of chapter 6 to the part where Jesus assembles the 12 apostles and just leave the Lord of the Sabbath part as the end of chapter 5? But whatever, right? We just roll with it. So the beginning of chapter 6 has this excerpt where Jesus and his disciples are kind of, going out about their business, doing whatever. And his disciples end up eating like some of the wheat kernels as they're going along. It's the equivalent of like if you're walking by, you're walking a mountain trail and you pick up some berries or something, and they eat it. And then I guess some Pharisees, this is, everyone makes jokes about this, right? Are these Pharisees like stalking? I mean, I guess they would be, because they're trying to catch Jesus in doing something wrong so that they can like discredit him, basically. So these Pharisees are stalking Jesus' guys, and they violate the Sabbath by plucking these wheat heads and eating from them. And then they're like, well, why? Okay, see, we caught you. You did something. Your guys did something wrong on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to be doing work on the Sabbath by plucking the wheat head and tearing it. You're technically working on the Sabbath, which then is kind of where it's on the one hand like, yeah, there's that technicality, like, yeah, they're technically breaking the Sabbath, but at the same time, like in modern day, we would kind of think of this as kind of ridiculous, right? Like if a person was like hungry and they were gonna take something like berries from a bush, right? You're not gonna freak out and be like, hey, it's the weekend, you can't be eating berries off the bush like that, right? No, like no one today would do that, right? No one today would do that unless it was a theft charge, but in this case, it's not treated that way. But anyway, Jesus responds to the Pharisees by saying something like, well, I mean, haven't you guys read the scriptures? Like, technically, David, a guy that people praised for being, a decent king, for some reasons than others, as I've talked about in the book of Samuel readings, which you can definitely check out the playlist for that. But even, David is still viewed as this upright historical figure. And then Jesus points out, well, technically, this guy that you Jews praise for being a pretty decent, good king, well, he broke the Sabbath. He did things that were unlawful according to the Jewish law by eating the bread of the presence, which was it was a bread that was set for the priest, and the priest often treated it like it was sacred bread. I'm trying to remember the exact passage this is from. It's basically I remember this. I remember the story, but I couldn't tell you the exact passage off the top of my head. I know, terrible, right? As a Bible scholar, I should have all these Bible verses memorized by their exact location. But basically, the story goes that during David was running around, not trying to get killed by Saul, and him and his guys, they went to this one place, and they basically they asked the priest there for food, and the priest is like, well, all we got is the bread of the presence, right? We don't have anything else. And David's like, that'll do, right? We're starving, we don't care. we'll eat whatever you can give us. And the priest's like, okay, I can give you this. This is all we got, though. Right? A little moldy, but I got nothing else. And David's like, whatever, I'll take it. And then of course that led to the priest, getting executed later by Saul, because Saul was like, what? You helped David? Well, we're going to kill you for it. And so by Jesus alluding to this story, Jesus is basically making this comparison of like the Pharisees acting like tyrants, because of course, relating them to Saul, and Saul, in his descent to madness was acting pretty tyrannical. And so that's a pretty big comparison that Jesus is kind of drawing here between the Pharisees and Saul. And of course, Saul is always looked down upon as like, oh, he's this pretty bad guy, and he is, for being a tyrant and all that. And so it's interesting that Jesus uses this comparison when he's talking about like, well, David, that's when Jesus uses the story about David eating the bread of the presence and saying that, like, what, you guys, like, want people to suffer, right? I mean, you guys are too strict on your rules. Isn't it not better for people to be fed than, to follow all the rules? Another interesting note here is that Jesus does use the Son of Man title again, which I've explained quite a bit last week about how the Son of Man is a divine title. And I talked about how you have to, I won't go into a lot of detail today, so check out last week's video for more detail on this. But basically, the Son of Man was this divine title based in the book of Daniel. And of course, the Son of Man is this person who the Ancient of Days which was a depiction of God, I guess is a better way of wording it. The Ancient of Days, aka Daniel's depiction of God, calls this Son of Man, who is this person, but this person is more than, well, a human being. He's more than that. He's something more than human. But he looks like a human, and that's why this figure is called the Son of Man. And the Ancient of Days calls the Son of Man, he calls him God. And so the running joke of whether people should, whether Jesus can be declared as God, and the joke would be, well, God calls him God. So if God calls Jesus God, then I guess you should call him God too. And so when Jesus uses the Son of Man title, he's referring to that passage, to where the Ancient of Days calls this Son of Man, God. And it's interesting that Jesus immediately jumps to that. He uses the David story and making this comparison of the Pharisees and Saul. And then he uses the Son of Man title for himself and talking about Lord of the Sabbath. And of course, Jesus is trying to not, well, I don't want to be, I don't like using the term reinterpret, because I know a lot of pastors and other people trying to teach this passage would say that Jesus reinterprets a lot of the scriptures, which is not really accurate. The better way of looking at it is Jesus restores life to the commandments, if that makes sense. So I know I have to explain what I mean when I talk about this. And I know this is going to take a while, so, buckle yourselves up. So, one of the... this is going to be a great stream because I get to make this reference again. But when we read through the Old Testament, more often than not, God is depicted as a being of death, which is ironic because God in Genesis is the creator of all things. And so there's this interesting duality in the nature of God. And of course, in a lot of people's minds, this duality is a problem in a lot of people's belief of God. That on the one hand, God is supposed to be the source of life and the nurturer of all things and the sustainer of the universe and all that. But at the same time, in the Old Testament, more often than not, God is depicted as the Grim Reaper, right? The taker of life, the one that is quick to take back the life he had given man. And so there's this weird duality about the character of God that we see in the Old Testament. And of course, the simple answer most people resort to when they talk about why this exists, this duality of God exists, is because, of course, the sin of man has tainted the world so much that God cannot stand this, can't stand humanity. He can't stand this earth. So anytime he's on it, death ensues. That's just kind of the natural order of things. And so, because God cannot be in the same world as sin, but at the same time, God interacts with the world. And so, when he does interact with the world, he just naturally becomes the Grim Reaper. It's just kind of what happens. And so, because of this, and we read through Exodus, has a lot of examples of this. I'm not just pulling the Grim Reaper thing just to be like, edgy. But you read through the book of Exodus, and I did a whole study on that. Check out that playlist too. Hashtag shameless self promotion. But anyway, in the book of Exodus, since God does this quite a bit, especially with like the Egyptians for starters, right? The Egyptians, get the scythe pretty hard. Because I'm gonna keep running with that metaphor. The Israelites, they become extremely fearful of God. And so as Moses developed the law and the Levitical law, people were quick to understand this as like a do this or die. And I mean, that's a and to be fair, that's a very rational thing to think. I'm not going to criticize Judaism for that thinking. As a matter of fact, it would be wrong to criticize them for that. It would be a very bad thing to criticize them. Because in the Jewish thinking, that was an absolutely correct way of assessing things. That when Moses was given the law, and then Moses built up the Levitical law from the Ten Commandments, then the people understood it as do this or die, right? Obey God or die. Because if we don't, basically the transition of logic was if we disobey God, then there is sin in us. And since God cannot be around sin, that means we have painted targets on ourselves to be executed. The book of Romans, Paul understood this pretty well. And this is where, like, once again, Paul, despite Paul championing a lot of, like, the Gentile acceptance into Christianity, because remember, Christianity started out as, like, a Jewish cult, for lack of better words. Paul, even though he championed a lot of the idea of Gentiles being accepted into Christianity, he's in the book of Romans, you see very Jewish thinking in his philosophy and his theology. And there's the famous passage of, well, the wages of sin is death. And that was something that, like, yeah, every Jew knew that. The wages of sin is death. And so, with that in mind, the entirety of the law and the entirety of Scripture would then be viewed with this death cult kind of thinking. Now, I know this is pretty edgy, so I know I'm going to get in some trouble for this. But basically, Judaism became this kind of death cult. That's just a blunt way of putting it. And that's why they were so serious on the sacrifices. And I talked a little bit about too in Exodus, about how, the sacrifice system was extremely strict on how they did sacrifices, because once again, if it was done wrong, then you were not appeased before God, and thus, the target for the Grim Reaper was not cleared off of you, because that's kind of how people view, like, okay, I sinned and now I'm a target. Because anytime God interacts with the world, people are going to die. And you read through Scripture, and more often than not, that's true. I mean, it's one of those funny things where when I defend that whole Grim Reaper analogy, I'm like, dude, have you ever read the Book of Psalms? Like, David refers to God, like, half the time as, like, a mass killer, right? A guy who destroys the armies of his enemies. I mean, how else do you interpret that? God crushes David's enemies under his heel. Right? How else do you interpret that? It's not like there's no metaphorical way of getting around that. Like, yeah, David depicts God as, like, the Grim Reaper a lot, and so I think it's because most people just recognize Psalm 23, right? Whereas, like, the complete opposite. Psalm 23 is, like, the weird psalm, and maybe that's why it's popular. Because, of course, Psalm 23 begins with, well, the Lord is my shepherd. A very different analogy from the Lord is my, shield protector and the killer of my enemies. And so, anyway. So, with this death cult mindset that had developed in Jewish thinking for a long time, and that's another thing too, that you can't really criticize Judaism for doing this, because this entered Jewish thinking really early, and it stuck for a long time. So you don't expect like Jesus shows up, you know, 1,500 years after Moses, and then you don't think people are going to change their thinking like that, right? It doesn't happen. That doesn't happen in real life. Okay, it's hard to it's hard enough to convince young Earth. You can't convince a young Earth creationist in like one discussion why they're wrong that the world was not created in 6 24-hour days. Okay, even though I've debunked that idea so many times using scripture, right? And you guys have seen that. Check out my Genesis playlist. Yeah, it'd be amazing if I don't. It would be a real achievement if I actually make a reference to check out all my other playlists at some point. But I've made that kind of point in my Genesis reading. But you can't convince a person in one discussion like why, okay, God did not create the earth in 6 24-hour days. You're not going to be able to convince someone in one conversation. Right? In the same way, you're not going to convince Jewish thinking that has been going on for like over 1,000 years to move out of this death cult idea. But of course, that's exactly what Jesus is trying to do. He's trying to change. He's trying to bring life into the commandments to move away from that death cult thinking. So he's trying. So the TLDR is, instead of thinking of if you commit sin you will die, how about God wants to bring life into you and forgive you? Those are two very different ideas, and Jesus is trying to bring that second idea out of Scripture, which is also evident in Scripture, hence the sacrifice system. And so this is something that's going to take Jesus a lot of work, and that's something that he's trying to do with, once again, he's not reinterpreting the idea of the Sabbath, going back to, well, the book of Luke. Because once again, the Pharisees have the death cult idea of how the Sabbath functions. Because in their mind, the Sabbath is, all right, we have done enough work in our life. This day is a day where we just remember God for being good and just be passive about how we live our lives and just be like in meditation. But Jesus' approach, which we will then talk about the next part of the story, where Jesus is in the synagogue on a different Sabbath, and he heals a person, and the shriveled right hand. Insert masturbation joke. I know someone's gonna do it. So the dude has a shriveled right hand. Why else do you think it's shriveled? And when the Pharisees are like, "Oh, you know what? Is Jesus gonna heal this guy on the Sabbath, right? This filthy sinner." See, that's why the joke works so well, right? You know, is Jesus gonna heal this filthy sinner on a Sabbath? Oh, you know. Right? And then that's where Jesus. Now this next part makes sense after I explain the whole death cult thing, right? And Jesus makes this interesting question. And at first, if I didn't give you that whole death cult context, this next statement might be kind of weird that Jesus makes. But now that I've explained the death cult thing in Jewish thinking pretty well, at least I think I did, this next part is kind of obvious, right? Where Jesus says, well, what's better to do on the Sabbath? Right? To restore life or to destroy it? To be proactive in your faith or to just let it be something you do for honorifics only and do nothing else about? Is the Sabbath about the life God wants to give us? Or is the Sabbath about us just dying, hoping God is happy with us? Which is it? And that's what Jesus is asking them, essentially. Is it right to restore life on the Sabbath or to destroy it? And that it's very profound that Jesus does this. Because once again, he's restoring life into the laws. He's restoring life into the commandments. And the shift is that belief in God should not be about the the fear of death, but rather the the joy of life and and the movement of life, I guess is the way I would word it. And so, on a side note, I think many Christians the early Christians understood this very well, which then led the Christians in the book of Acts to do a very heretical move. Oh, what? Christians doing a heretical move in the book of Acts? But anyway, in the book of Acts, there's this interesting thing that happens. And the book of Acts only makes a reference to this, but it had stuck in church tradition since, I mean, to the present day. And that was, of course, once again, Christians that understand this well enough, even the heretical move doesn't really matter all that much. And so the big heretical move Christians made was they changed their day of worship from the Saturday, which in the Jewish traditional world would have been the Sabbath, and they moved the day of worship from the Sabbath to the Sunday, the next day. Of course, since a lot of early Christians were Jewish as well, they celebrated both days to be honorable. But they added the worship of Jesus on the Sunday. And the reason for that was that, see, if you go with the Jewish mindset of putting the Sabbath at the end of the very last day of the week, once again, it's this whole like, you live and then you die. And, you know, the Sabbath is a reminder that the end comes for us all, right? And I always make this reference of like the universal rule across religions, across cultures, across time. The universal rule is everybody knows, everybody lives and everybody dies. But the Christian mindset reversed that and said, well, of course everybody dies. But the real question is, do you truly live? And so by moving the day of worship onto the Sunday, the Christians made the heretical move by believing that we worship on the first day of the week because that is what empowers us to move forward and live. And so we can face any challenge in life, we can be good to people and be motivated and proactive in being good to people because we live in the life of God. And of course, I am explaining something that will once again become much more clear as we get to the book of Acts, because this will come back, obviously, in the book of Acts. This idea that as Lord of the Sabbath, since Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, by extension, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, then it is not, Jesus is bringing life back into the law, as opposed to allowing the law to just remind us about the eventual death we will face because of sin in our lives and the fact that there is sin in this world. But instead, Jesus is saying here, by being Lord of the Son of Man being Lord of the Sabbath, there is life instead of death. And because there is life awaiting us, then we can move forward. And that's fundamentally the big idea that's played out in this whole story thing here in the beginning of chapter 6, which I thought would have been a much better way to like end chapter 5. But I mean, that's why I gave my review about chapter 5 earlier, right? Because it's relevant to this. But now for something totally different. Something totally different. We're just going to talk a little bit about the assembling of the 12, just briefly. After all, the point of this passage in Luke is just kind of like oh yeah, here, you know, the apostles, yeah, this is how like the archbishops, I guess we could say at the time, and the Pope was around here too. You know, in Catholic tradition, Peter was the first Pope, so you know the Pope and a bunch of the archbishops, the other apostles. This is when Jesus selected them and who they are and so on. Of course, there's the interesting twist that there's Judas Iscariot among the apostles, and Luke even makes a note that, yeah, this is the same Judas that's going to betray him later. Because once again, This will make more sense when we get to the book of Acts. But as I've said before, since the book of Acts would have been written first, before the book of Luke, when stuff is said about Judas in the book of Acts, you're like, oh, how did this happen? Well, the prequel will tell you how it happened, basically. But at the same time, because since the book of Luke is the prequel, if you will, then Luke is also making the distinction of like, yeah, we're talking about this guy, and yeah, you know who this guy is, Judas Iscariot. You know who he is, the guy who's going to betray him. So that note is kind of made. You already know who this is. Moving on. All right, now for some other meaty parts of chapter 6. And this is going to be like, this is going to take a while, so buckle yourselves up. Double buckle now, because I already told you to buckle up before. So now you got to add another buckle. So basically, the first part of the teaching here, this is verse 17 to, let's say, 26. And most people treat this as like the blessing and woes that Jesus talks about. And the funny thing is, the blessing part is like a short version of the Beatitudes. Of course, the Beatitudes is found in Matthew 5, and in Matthew 5 there's the whole like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied, etc., etc. I know I didn't do that in order, but you get the point. There's like a whole bunch of them in the book of Matthew. The book of Luke, it's cut down quite a bit, because once again, in the book of Matthew, when you read all of them, some of them do get a little bit like, hey, didn't you already kind of make this comparison? Some of these guys kind of double. Luke is kind of just more direct with it, right? And only picks the ones that he really cares about, I guess. So those who are poor, then the kingdom of God will be their inheritance, and those who thirst, those who hunger for righteousness, you will be satisfied, etc., etc. And so the book of Luke just kind of goes a straightforward approach when it has the Beatitudes here. Can't really say why that's the case, why Luke decides to just shorthand it. Maybe the simple assumption is that maybe people were aware of the Matthew account and how the churches with Matthew would have been telling this passage. Maybe they were aware of that. We don't know. I think it's too clear. This is also true with the woes part as well. The list is also much longer in the book of Matthew version. Once again, part of it is repetitive in the book of Matthew account. So maybe that's another that's the Occam's razor reason why I think Luke just kind of uses only a few parts of the list, because he probably cut out anything that felt repetitive. And to be fair, in the book of Matthew, some of it is a little bit repetitive. And so Luke is just like, okay, we're just going to go with these ones. Moving on. Then we get to one of the most famous passages that it makes people, you know, the next set of verses is a part that makes a lot of people raise eyebrows, and it is one of the really confusing parts to read, let alone try to apply it. So we're going to talk about this part in great detail and work through this together, because I know this next part is always a really challenging part. Excuse me. Now Jesus says here, he says, love your enemies. And then he says some pretty out there stuff. And for example, it's like, okay, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, I think it, okay, in the Luke version, it doesn't actually say right cheek or left cheek. In the book of Matthew, it actually says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, then give him your left side also. Of course, the book of Matthew, when the book of Matthew uses very specific wording, there's certain contexts applied to it. The book of Luke doesn't exactly lend itself to that, but I think they can still be applied to an extent. So in the book of Matthew version of the love your enemies, and thus, you know, if a person slaps you on the right cheek, the book of Matthew will say, if a person strikes you on the right side of your cheek, then also lend him your left to slap as well. This is the famous turn the other cheek phrase comes from. Now, logically, since in the ancient world, most people were viewed as right-handed, after all, if you were left-handed, you were referred to as sinister. Check out my Book of Judges playlist. Yes. All right. How many more lists do we have that I have to say, like, please check these ones out? I think that's all of them. No, this. Anyway, check my Book of Judges playlist for that reference. But basically, if you were viewed as left-handed, you were viewed as sinister. And of course, sinister in our English language is something we refer to like bad people, right? So this is where, like, once again, I made this reference in the Book of Judges reading, that like that's why some people thought like it was witchcraft or something when people were like left-handed, and there was this strict idea of like people will be right-handed. But anyway, with that said, for the most part in the ancient world, everybody was right-handed. So in order to hit someone on the right side of the face, you have to use your backhand. And of course, this is something that translates regardless of culture, religion, time period. It don't matter where and when. A backhand is a sign of major disrespect. If you backhand someone, it's a sign of major disrespect. And so when Jesus is making this bold claim of like when someone strikes your right cheek, the assumption is with their right hand, and thus would be a backhand. Turn the other cheek. And so it's a lot more than just like, oh, a person hits you, let them hit you again. But it's more like, if someone disrespects you, don't sink to their level. And it's okay to let them keep like, not in the sense of like be a doormat, but rather don't sink to their level. And that is the real reason I think that Jesus says turn the other cheek. Because the typical thing, and you read in other parts of the Bible, well, if someone hits you on the right cheek, then you should also hit their right cheek. The famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And so if you hit someone's right cheek, well, you also going to do the backhand, and it's just a back and forth disrespect. But, when people do that, you just get like endless vicious cycles of hatred, violence, and aggression. I mean, if Twitter isn't enough proof for you, I don't know what is. But basically, when Jesus is saying this whole turn the other cheek, it's not merely this idea of like, oh, let people walk over you. And I think that's how a lot of people misinterpret it, right? Of if a person hits you, well, then let them hit you on the other side as well. Just be a doormat. That's not what Jesus is actually saying. What he's actually saying is, if you want to show real love, don't sink to low levels of disrespect like that, because you are better than that. And you can, or I shouldn't say you are better than that. Jesus is trying to inspire people that they can be better than that, I guess would be a more accurate way of putting it. And so Jesus is saying, look, I want you to be better. I want you to be better than how the world behaves. And that's the interesting thing that Jesus later does in this love the enemy passage. He talks about how like, oh, if you lend to someone and you expect something back, well, sinners do that too. And it's interesting that Jesus uses that language when he talks about like the common person as sinners. But the idea that Jesus is getting at is that like, as my people, you will be better. I will make you better people. And part of that means you don't sink down to the levels of, the sinful. You don't sink down to the old ways that, led to the whole fear-mongering and the death cults, right? You don't sink to that level. And maybe this is the real reason why chapter 6 is the way it is and starts off with the Sabbath story. Because, once again, Jesus is breathing life into the law as opposed to reinterpreting it, which is not accurate. But by breathing life in, he's saying, you don't sink down to those levels. We're not part of this death cult anymore. Jesus is bringing us from a death cult to a life of faith is the typical Christian expression. Or we can say life cult if you want to keep the cult language going on. Jesus is moving us from death to life. And this is something that in Christianese, Christians use this expression kind of loosely. But I think people sometimes lose the weight of it when you know, just throw that phrase around, you know, from death to life. Obviously, the resurrection is the epitome of that. But it, you know, Jesus is painting little parts of that here. And this is where going back with the love the enemy passage comes in. You don't sink down to that level. Of course, the reason why I have to interpret it this way, I know some people will say, well, that you're kind of really doing some mental gymnastics, Michael. And that's a thing you can legitimately think. But at the same time, I'm trying to reconcile other parts of the Bible that say, well, it's fine to protect yourself. Let's say when someone tries to kill you, right? I don't think it works if someone stabs you, you know, if someone stabs your right chest, you know, pull the knife out and give it back to them so they can stab your left part, right? Like, that's not what Jesus is talking about when he says, you know, turn the other cheek. But what I think he's actually talking about is, you know, don't sink down to that level when it comes to something like disrespect, right? Because you're better than that. When it comes to fighting for your life, I think there are exceptions to the rule, right? When you fight for your life, it's okay to kill somebody else. But in this case, the face slapping thing, it's about how we ought to behave to people. And behavior is a pretty key factor in what Jesus is trying to instill in his followers, which we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But anyway, this is where, once again, there's the whole, like, okay, if someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. And what's the other one? Give to everyone who asks of you. If anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back, yada, yada, yada. Once again, when Jesus is talking about in this passage of the love your enemies and don't be like so demanding of retribution, I guess is the right word for it. Jesus is, for all intent, you know, I'm going to keep using this phrasing because this is what we're running with. He's moving out of the death cult idea that the Jewish people have been living with for a pretty long time now. Jesus is basically telling them, we're moving out of that system. We're not going to think that way anymore. Religion isn't about the freaky death cult stuff. That's not what religion is about. Okay? Which is one of those things that even to this day, human beings struggle to get out of that. Because once again, to be fair, and this is why, once again, you can't criticize the Jews for doing this, because everybody does this, that we have an inclination to just associate everything with death cults. That's how we behave as human beings when it comes to any kind of do's and don'ts, rules and regulations. It's all about the death cult stuff, as opposed to how to live better or stuff like that. Human beings are just so fixated on that. And that's why I think the death cult thing analogy works so well, because it's something that we all intuitively understand. And Jesus is trying to pull us out of that and say, no, we're not going to think like that anymore, guys. Come on, guys, we can do better. I'm going to make you better. You don't have to think death culty anymore. That's what Jesus is trying to do here. And so once again, the contrast that Jesus brings up as we continue reading, as you go through the rest of the love your enemy passage, you know, the sinners can love each other, because, you know, death cult see, death cult do, right? And so but at the same time, if everybody just does things the old ways, then you'll never move on. You'll never move forward, right? We'll always be stuck in this only viewing at the end, like death as the end. Stop that, right? Stop that is what Jesus is trying to say with this passage. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss when they read this passage. They just get too fixated on like the mental images of like, okay, someone slaps you on the right cheek and then you let them slap your other half, right? I remember there was that one joke. I can't remember who did it exactly. It was some kind of like Saturday Night Live skit. And how the skit goes down is there's what's his name? I'm trying to remember the actor that was there, and he meets Jesus, and he the actor he slaps him, and then Jesus, like, after he gets hit, he goes like this, and then the guy's like, what the hell? And the then there's like Jesus says like some pretty regular lines, and then the guy like totally misinterprets it to be something ridiculous. I think it was Snoop Dogg actually was the act the because he was the guest for SNL that day. It was a long time ago I saw this, but it just comes to mind when I think about this passage. And so I don't know why I brought that up. I just thought it was funny. But Jesus is trying to move us out of the death cult thinking. And I think that's the real purpose of how chapter 6 is structured. And with that in mind, that's how we should read the love your enemies part. Because once again, cross cultures, across time, across religions, and this idea of like, well, it's easy to hate your enemies. And I mean that is true, right? And only love a certain selective people. But this isn't the first time the Bible tells us to love our enemies. Right? The Old Testament actually has a few passages like this in the book of Exodus. It's like, well, love the foreigner, love the enemy. And then, of course, in the same breath, God says also love God. So God counts as foreigner and enemy in that sense. He can be counted as those things. And of course, when you read the Old Testament, the reason why God says it that way is because to show real love is meant to be difficult. And then Jesus is, once again, reinterpreting that. I know I can't think of better words to use, because that's the problem with language, right? We can't think of better words to use. But by reinterpreting the love, how we understand love. And so it's when Jesus talks about here, it's no accomplishment that like you can like people who are like you. Right? That's easy. But of course, the other thing too, if you want to move to in a modern sense, loving the enemy is something we must do, because if you fall into the older thinking that Jesus is trying to move us out of, you run into all kinds of other problems that we are running into right now in society and as a culture, as people. Right? Because I mean, the easy example is like liking people who are like you. Okay, the easy one we could put is like racism, right? Okay, it's easy as an Asian person for me to like other Asian people. But I don't know if I'm going to like the foreigner, quote unquote, which are other people that are not Chinese people, right? Like, that's a very racist idea. But Jesus is saying, like, no, none of that, right? And so, love the foreigner, love your enemies. The fundamental idea is not the people themselves that you're loving. Is you have to change that really shitty way of thinking of doing things that only serve you. And that's another big contrast that Jesus has here, right? Is that when you do things, you don't do it to just serve you. Because one, you got to serve God. And two, God demands that human beings are good to each other. And a way of doing that is that we serve each other. But you're not going to be able to serve each other if you're stuck thinking like, well, I can only like people or love people who are like me. Because that leads to stuff like racism, classism, sexism, ageism, or whatever. Which is, well, I don't think anyone would disagree that those things are all bad things. Those are evil things. And so Jesus is trying to say, well, the way you do that is you go extra lengths. And I think that's the other thing too, with these extreme analogies Jesus makes about like, oh, if someone takes your coat, give them your shirt also. It's meant the absurdity of that is to kind of play at extremes, to really show that like you have to go through great lengths to show real love, and real love has to be extended to beyond people who are just like you. And how does Pocahontas say it? Are the only people are the people who you think are people are the people who look and think like you? I think it's something like that. Someone please get the actual words of that song because it's a beautiful song, Colors of the Wind. But that, if you think of that song in Pocahontas, Colors of the Wind, it's exactly that, right? To show real love, you have to go beyond what we know, aka the death cult thinking. We have to go beyond that, and that's something Jesus is calling us to. And to be fair, it's not easy, and Jesus will say multiple times, "Oh, that ain't easy." I mean, going back with the book of Exodus, God says His commands with that full awareness that, like, yeah, I know it's not easy, but I will make a way. And then that's where the rest of the laws come in. Right? But anyway, we got to move on because we're already an hour in, and we still got quite a bit of chapter 6 left. So let's move on to another very meaty part of chapter 6. And this is also another famous passage. Matthew has a longer version of this as well. But we'll cover it in the Luke account. And it's the judging one, the do not judge passage. Oh, yes. This one has been a passage of many a contention that I've, had to deal with when people try to be a smartass about it and be like, oh, don't judge or whatever. But when many Christians themselves use this passage, they tend to only use the first part, do not judge. And then they blot out the rest of the Bible there. It's like, okay, just follow that part. But keep reading. Right? Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will forgive. Keep going, and then we get the golden rule. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you, which is Jesus' version of the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated. So the funny part is see, this is where, like, once again, this is an intellectual biblical laziness. They take the first part and say, okay, that's good. But it's like, no, the last part is more important. Treat others as you would be treated. Now, this in a vacuum sounds straightforward, right? Okay, if you want people to be good to you, you should be good to others. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. It makes sense. It makes all kinds of logical sense, so there's no reason not to do it. But we have to read this in context to the love your enemies. And this expansion of the, don't just like and love people who are like you. But you have to show love and extend that to all people. And then you read the do not judge and then continue on to the measure that you use will be used on you. And so this passage is meant to kind of show this urgency and the reality of showing real love. And real love is something that we all expect, but at the same time, it is expected of you. So with this, I'm going to jump into a very interesting topic. Not exactly, I could always come back to this in one of the podcasts. It definitely works for a podcast. But I'll talk a little bit about it here. And I may bring this up in a podcast in the future. But basically, this passage it kind of reflects something that the Bible is totally aware it does, but I don't know if people are aware that the Bible does this. And I call it the forgiveness paradox. And the Bible the Bible does this very well. The forgiveness paradox is basically this. On the one hand, as you read through the laws, you read through a lot of the stories in the Bible, there's this theme of forgiveness. And that theme is played out like this. God demands that you and I forgive people that do wrong to us. Of course, that is not easy. Because and this is one of those things too that, like, when I say forgive people, like, be able to forgive basically anything. Even some major atrocities. There was a book written, I don't think I have my copy of it anymore. I think someone ended up stealing mine, for lack of better words. It's one of those problematic things where you lend people stuff and you don't keep track of it. But anyway, It was a book called The Sunflower by what was the guy's name? Simon something. Simon W. We'll call him Simon W. His last name is like a weird long name because it's Jewish, so it's a weird long W name. But anyway, Simon Wiesenthal? Wiesenthal. If someone knows the actual guy's name, the author's name, please tell me. I mean, I could just look it up, but I have like stuff on. I have my notes on this monitor, and I didn't bother writing this guy's name down. So in the sun, because I didn't really plan to talk about this, but in the Sunflower, there's a story about Simon, and he meets this former Nazi on his deathbed, and the former Nazi talks about some pretty awful things he did, how he took joy in punishing and torturing people, how he raped a young girl and stuff like that. And it was just kind of the parkour of how Nazis treated Jews. And so the Nazis confessing all this to Simon, he's confessing and talk about like all the terrible things he did. And then the Nazi asks Simon to forgive him. And then how the story goes, how the story plays out, is Simon has no words after hearing everything that he's heard. He has no words. And when the Nazi asks him to forgive him, he has no words. After a moment of silence, he gets up and he walks out. He has no idea how to respond to that. The story ends with him visiting the Nazi's mother. This old lady just kind of minding her own business, and this Jewish guy walks up, and the woman, she pines, she wonders, whatever happened to her son. Left to go to war, fight for the Nazis, but she never heard about him ever again. And Simon is conflicted whether he should tell her what happened. And then he kind of just gives her some comforting words about you can't live with regret. You can't really think about the past anymore and move on. But then he doesn't really tell her anything, and then he just kind of leaves, and that's the end of the story. I know I did a terrible summary, but it's one of those things you kind of have to. The Sunflower is something you should read for yourself. But anyway, of course, the story itself is actually kind of short. It's only 100 pages, and then the other half of the book, despite being a 200-page book, the other half of the book is actually a bunch of other people's commentary on what Simon should have done, from Bishop Desmond Tutu to the Dalai Lama. And all these different people give their opinion of what Simon should have done. And some people say, no, you can't forgive that. Other people say, you should forgive him. And yada, yada, yada. And the reason why I bring up this book is because the question of forgiveness is so deep in that context. Because, of course, the atrocities this guy does. And the question of forgiveness, is there a limit to forgiveness and stuff like that? Questions like that. Is there a limit to forgiveness? How much can we forgive? Are some people entitled to forgiveness? Are some people not? And this is where once again, the commentary of a whole bunch of different people, comes into play, because they all kind of play around with these questions. And so, going back to the Bible's forgiveness paradox, God leaves it kind of open-ended on what the limits are and whatnot, to an extent. But at the same time, God demands quite a bit. And I use that wording very specifically, right? That God demands that we are able to forgive a lot of people's atrocities, quite a fair amount. And of course, there's the famous passage where Peter asks Jesus, well, how many times must I forgive my brother? Well, 7 times. Is it 7 times? And then Jesus gives the remark of 7 times 70. Of course, once again, the numbers are not literal. There's a symbolic thing with 7 and 70. But anyway, besides the point. The point is that God demands that you forgive. Even though we go to the caveat of that, and that's why I brought up the sunflower, was because, well, that ain't easy, and the Bible is totally aware that ain't easy. It's probably the hardest shit anyone would ever have to do, is to forgive someone. But of course, the Christian story is that God ultimately forgives human beings of all kinds of atrocities. And of course, we read some of these great quote unquote biblical heroes, and it's not because of how great they are, but how much God has forgiven of them. And by extension, how those people live out the forgiven life, if you will. Of course, Paul the Apostle is one of the clearest examples of this. A former anti-Christian terrorist becomes champion of the Christian faith. And so it's kind of that hilarious, complete opposite swing. And so, on the one hand, God demands forgiveness. But at the same time, this is all the more reason of why Jesus' death and resurrection is so important. And I mean, the crux of the Christian faith, but that's besides the point. And it's that without Jesus' forgiveness, then we can't forgive. So on the one hand, God demands that we all forgive. But at the same time, even though it's so hard, well, God has made a way for us to forgive through Jesus Christ. And of course, the Christianese one-liner that Christians use is, Jesus has forgiven the unforgivable in you, so you can forgive the unforgivable in others, which is not 100% true. Because once again, we all need that from Jesus. I cannot forgive someone for atrocities, but I can lead someone to Jesus who can forgive them of that. Just as Jesus has forgiven all the wrong things in my own life. And of course, there's then other technicalities people try to work around with like, oh, well, I haven't done things as bad as other people, so I don't have to forgive people of these certain things because I've never done those bad things, or those things are worse than the bad things I've ever done, so da 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 da. And there's all kinds of other justifications, and that's its own discussion. That would be in a podcast in the future, no doubt. Because I should probably find a copy of the Sunflower, reread it, and then we can do like a podcast / book study of it. I think it's something everybody should read. Actually, the Sunflower is good. It's not in my top 5 of like a book everybody should read, because I have that list too. Sunflower might not cut that list, unfortunately, because as good as it is, it doesn't hit all the spots properly. And once again, you can hit the same themes with other books. So the Sunflower is not one of those everybody must read it books, but I think it's something it's something a lot of people should read. It's something everybody should read. It's not in the top 5, but it's up there. Anyway, I'm going pretty far off the beaten path here with going back with the judging others, and the crux of that passage is actually, the next verse, and it's, for what measure you use, it will be measured unto you. And so that, once again, there's this interesting, how do I put it? It's an interesting paradigm here, where it's expected that you act good to people. But what will inspire you to act good to others? And that's, once again, the Christian answer would be, well, Jesus, in his mercy and his forgiveness and all that, that's what empowers us. I mean, yeah, obviously. But how does that come about? How does that play out? And by extension, how then do we display that level of freedom, if you will, when we treat other people good, when we treat other people well, in a good way? I got caught up there. I was like, how does that grammatically work? I almost said treat people good, which grammatically doesn't work. But anyway, going back with the do not judge passage, and then many people tend to scribble out, and then Jesus uses a parable to illustrate that point of how that plays out. If I'm to be good to people, what will inspire me to be good to people? The forgiveness paradox thing. And then Jesus gives this weird thing about how, like, contrary to a lot of other stories, and I'm not talking about like anime tropes of the student surpassing the teacher in combat. Jesus not talking about that. He's talking about the inspiration of which, we talked about being good to each other. Oh, this thing just came off. I'll have to fix it later. But it's like kind of distracting. Anyway, excuse me. So in this weird passage about the teacher, the students will never surpass the teacher, but when the students do what the teacher says, they become like the teacher. Which is more of that's how the idea of Christian or disciple works. I will use those interchangeably. I know some people try to be a smartass, and I remember reading this guy's post about how, like, well, the word Christian is only used 4 times in the entire New Testament, but the word disciple is used 200 and something times. So we shouldn't aspire to be Christians. We should aspire to be disciples. And I was like, this, like, just because the Bible says it a certain way, like, once again, when the Bible was written, the word Christian wasn't even a real word. It was an insult word, actually. Little fun fact. The word Christian was kind of used as like a teasing word to make fun of people who were Christians. And then I guess Christians just kind of stuck with it. That's a great example of turning the other cheek, right? Just like, yeah, we're gonna run with it. But in the word itself, Christian, or Christianos, this is the Greek word it comes from, it means little Christ. And so the idea is that, well, if I obey the commandments of Jesus, then I become like Jesus, and thus I am a little Christ. That's the idea. And Christians ran with that, and it's like, actually, that's actually kind of awesome. Let's go with that. And so going back to this Luke passage, that's kind of what Jesus kind of trying to inspire in his followers. Like, well, I want you to obey. When you obey my commandments and live like I do, then people will see, God in you. Because, well, if they see, well, basically, and then Jesus uses this kind of transient of logic in the book of John, where it's like, well, if they see you live the right way and you obeying God's commandments and following Jesus, then by that they see Jesus. And when they see Jesus, they see God. So that's kind of the transient of logic. And the book of Luke gives like an early version of that. The book of John goes into this a lot more detail. But the book of Luke kind of gives us a little bit where, like, if you do everything like the teacher does, referring to himself, then people will see, the teacher, in you. Of course, that's fundamentally the goal of any self-respecting Christian, is to live in a way that people. And I remember like a lot of Christians try to make it sound cool, right? It's like, well, you evangelize by living a godly life, and then people will see Jesus in you. That's the Christianese way we say it. And the idea is that, yeah, when you live obeying God, then people will see that, like, yeah, there's something special about you, and it's not about you; it's about, well, God in you. That's kind of the idea, and that is what Jesus is trying to inspire in his disciples here, and that's why the do not judge thing and the teacher thing comes up. Is because, okay, treat others as you want to be treated. Well, why don't you treat people well? Why don't you treat them as best as you can? And I'm going to show you how. And when you imitate me, then people will see me in you. And that's what this whole passage is getting at. As opposed to the more basic things of, like, don't judge people, turn the other cheek when people slap you or whatever. It's not just, that's the surface level stuff. The deeper stuff is about how we are empowered by God to imitate him. And then by doing so, people will see God through you. And of course, I've talked about this in the Exodus readings, about how that was like the prime job of a parent, was to be an example of God to their kids. And so that was why the honor of the parents command was worded the way it was, and why there's actually a special treatment for parents in the Bible. And the subtext was basically, well, parents, teach your children in the ways of the Lord so that they will walk in obedience and continue a cycle of uprightness and holiness. And so the expectation was that parents were supposed to teach their kids well. And what I talked about in that passage was how fundamentally with human beings, and this is also why, like, more often than not, when you read through like the Bible, and it's sure God acts pretty extreme at times, but at the same time, a lot of people, especially older people and especially parents, they're like, yeah, I get how God behaves, because more often than not, a lot of God's actions are much akin to a parent. I mean, minus the fact that God himself calls himself a parent and always uses the father and mother analogies about himself. But basically, the parental role was that the way I worded it in the Exodus reading was that a parent is a child. Or, your parents is the first person. Or no, sorry. Let me word it better. Your parents are your first contact with God. And so how your parents treat you actually influences a fair amount about how you think about God. Of course, this can change as you get older, but as in your developing years, for sure, anything you associate with God, you will also associate with your parents. And I made this joke, and I'll make it again, where in that 70s show, Eric Foreman actually does it kind of right, where he fears Red Foreman. And there's a part where some people, some of Eric's friends are like, why don't you just stick it up to him? Your dad can't order you around, whatever. And Eric's like, you're joking, right? He's God. And, the show plays it off as a joke, but there's a lot of truth in that too. In that, in Eric's mind, anything his dad says is equal to the word of God in his mind. And for a lot of us, that is true on a subliminal level. And there's the case that can be made, and there obviously are exceptions to the rule, because human beings are human beings, right? It's not a perfect one-to-one correlation between parents and God. But usually, the way your parents treat you, the way they behave, influences how you think about God. I will probably bring this up in a podcast in the future, because I think that it would be more appropriate in that context, as opposed to I'm supposed to talk about the book of Luke right now. But I've known, I mean, this is if you talk to people and you talk to them about God, you can actually learn a lot about their attitude toward God by just asking about their family life. And so, in contrast, there are two people I hang out with quite a bit on my buddy's server, and there are two very different extremes, where one person was very positive anytime I talked about God, and this guy's not a Christian, but anytime I talked about God, he was actually extremely positive anytime I talked about it, and that is because his family is pretty awesome. His family are really nice people. They're very accepting. They do whatever they can to provide for their kids. They sound like pretty upstanding people. From what I've heard of them and the way that my friend talks about his parents, he talks about his parents with a lot of great respect and how much he loves them, how important they are to him, and yada yada yada. And so, because he views his family so positively, especially his parents, anytime I talk about God, he also views very positively, because subliminally he's anything I talk about God, he's relating it to how his parents act. And so and of course, once again, because the Bible does this a lot, it akins God to a parent. And when I make those comparisons, my friend, he can see that. And so when I talk about Christianity and I talk about God with him, he's very positive. On the flip side, there was another person who had a very abusive father. And because their father, and not even just their father, but like there's so much family drama. It's like this person's family is the kind of family you find in like those train wreck TV dramas where like siblings are on drugs, mother's super neglective, father's abusive, you know, all the shitty parts of a family unit in those like TV dramas. This person had a family like that. And this person, of course, because she's hung around with, well, now I gave away the person's gender. Because this person's hung around with me quite a bit, that I hope I've changed a little bit of that by being a positive role model. And because, you know, this person's an adult, so it's a little different when you become an adult. But before, you know, I'd like to think my positive influence helped. But before that, this person's like view on God was very negative. And you can't blame them. You can't blame them. Because family life was like down the crapper. So once again, you do the whole God akinning God to a parent. Well, I'm not gonna you akin God to an abusive father. Yeah, that's not gonna fly very far, right? and so and so yeah, it was pretty rough. And you know, evangelizing this person was a lot harder because of that. And you know, that's all the more reason why there's a moral obligation to be like hold parents accountable and to for people to be good parents, right? Because you know, it's one of those things that like it's easy to say, but I don't think people understand the application of like your actions have consequences, and it's even way more so the older you get, and if you become like a parent or something. I mean, it's easy to like shit on bosses that like, oh yeah, your actions have consequences, and so we all make jokes of like the bosses with like scandals, you know, having sex with subordinates and stuff like that. It's easy to make fun of those kind of analogies, but you think of like a boss in a workplace. If a if the boss has like kind of bad ethics, it shows, and then it spreads like a disease to like all those working under him, all the way down to the grunt worker employees. And of course, you know, if you want to go the political route, that's one of the fundamental problems of modern day capitalism, because it's not so much of capitalism itself, but it's the fact that since any system ran by humans is bound for corruption, so when that top guy acts like a dickbag, it spreads like a disease all the way down. And that's true, and that's so true. Because and that's why hierarchies are important, because that, you know, we associate God with hierarchy in that way. And parents are the first contact for a human life, because you know a parent is your first authority figure. So, and then that's true across, no matter, you know, whether it's family or your workplace or whatever kind of social structure that you exist in. The people at the top are kind of akin to God in some sense. And that's why, you know, if you're an influencer, like for example, like YouTube or whatever, if you're an influencer, that's why you have to be so careful about how you live and how you conduct yourself. Because it comes back to, now we've circled back to the book of Luke. It comes back to how we live, and if we expect, you know, how we treat others, and the measure used for us, or the measures we use to others, will be used on us. And so that's all the more reason that Jesus is saying here, be good to each other, because God, not just because God demands it, which is true, God does demand that we be good to each other, but because of how fast it can infect other people when you don't do what's right. Which then leads to the tree passage, which some people may think is a weird transition, but it's really not. When Jesus talks about, well, a bad tree can't bear good fruit, and a good fruit cannot bear bad fruit. You will know a tree by its fruit. But Jesus isn't actually talking about trees. He's talking about like how we live and our behavior. So, and I brought up that word, our behavior. So the other things like love your enemies, judging people properly, and right measures and all that, being good to each other, you know, those are actions and thought. Those are actions. But your actions come from inside you. They come from, you know, your inner being, And the word we use for that is your behavior. And so Jesus says, well, you can't just do good actions because you can only fake it for so long. What you need to do, and once again, through the power of God, which is the underlying subtext, but basically what you need to do is in your inner person, you need to create someone who wants to live for good. You have to live for good on a behavioral level, because then that will carry out in how you act to other people. Because sure, you can fake being good to people for a while, but if you are to truly be good to all kinds of people, because remember, the demand is high, right? Love your enemies is a very high demand. The measure you use in those contexts will be brought upon you, so you better take it seriously. And if you're gonna do that right, you better cultivate righteous living in your own life, and that's where the tree thing comes in. And essentially, Jesus is talking about behavior, but of course, that word doesn't exist here. So I'm gonna use the word behavior, but Jesus is trying to change our behavior, and it makes sense what Jesus is talking about when he talks about, "For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." And I mean, it's more than just your mouth, but the words are used as like a powerful metaphor of like extension of yourself. I mean, think about like this stream, for example. All I do is talk, right? But all the words I say are meant to be an extension of who I am. But anyway, in this good tree, bad tree, good fruit, bad fruit thing, it's about behavior. And what Jesus is trying to say is we got to cultivate good behavior. And it also extends to the next part, so I might as well just kind of cover the next part too, and talk about the tree and the two houses, 2 trees and 2 houses. I'll talk about them like they're one story. And fundamentally, what they both get at is you have to develop a good inner person. Of course, once again, that comes from God filling us with, His Spirit, His power, His wisdom, etc., etc. God does the bulk of that work, but that is required for how we are to live, because you can't try and do it on your own strength, because you try to do it on yourself, you're just going to fake it, and you can only fake it for so long. The 2 houses story paints this in the foundation language, building a house on a foundation of rock, so the rock would be pretty sturdy, and then the other one was without a rock. Many people would say it's a house of sand. Whatever it is, it's not a rock, is what the Bible's getting at. It's not something solid like a rock. That's what I was getting at. And because it's not solid, it breaks down when the torrent comes. And the funny thing is, of course, like a torrent is pretty extreme. But the point is, well, a torrent can, anything can happen. But can the house stand? And only if it has a strong foundation, it has a good inner character. If only you have a good inner character, then can you withstand, right? Because once again, this is where the faking it doesn't quite work. Fake it till you make it. At least in spiritual things like this, it doesn't work, because eventually you'll get called out, you'll get pulled out, and then your real person is going to be shown, right? And if your real person doesn't match up, there's lots of repercussions behind that. That's the foundation of cancel culture. In some sense, not in all senses, but that's kind of a big thing that happens with cancel culture. For example, I'll use cancel culture as a good example. Right? We catch, some people say they're like, oh, I champion. Well, the reason why cancel culture happens, I'll use one example where it's like, okay, someone champions, like, I'm for LGBTQ rights, and then they find out that this person actually is like extremely homophobic and uses all kinds of anti-gay slurs and whatever all the time, and then you're like, huh, right? When you meet these people, and then when the reality of these people come out, and it gets pretty ugly pretty fast. Jesus saying, well, yeah, because you don't have that foundation of rock, right? That foundation of rock in you. And of course, this is why the Bible also uses the illustration of God as my rock, right? That firm foundation of which we can build our lives on and create our behaviors from. Going back to the fruit side of the story, when you have that proper foundation and the right nurturing from God, then you will be a good tree because you will produce good fruit. And that's the interesting thing too, because on the one hand, it's like, well, it's the tree, it's the right treatment of the tree that brings good fruit. But you never evaluate a tree by like, hey, like you don't go up to a tree and be like, hey, I want to meet the guy who, or let me put it this way. Okay, you don't walk into an apple tree. You don't walk up to an apple tree and be like, I want to know if this tree's good by finding the person who takes care of this tree. Bring me that guy. And I want him to tell me every detail about this tree he's been taking care of. No one does that, right? How do we evaluate an apple tree if it's good? You take an apple and you bite into it. That's the easy way of doing things. Of course, if the if the if the fruit is bad, then it goes all the way back to the treatment of the tree. But you don't. No, most of us don't think of it on that level. You just think, oh, bad fruit, therefore tree not very good. And that's even though there's more to it, and that's where I bring up the whole, well, a good tree is still nurtured by the Holy Spirit and all that, which is the underlying text. Just like how in an apple orchard, you obviously have good. There's an actual name for these people, apple farmers. There's an actual name for it, but people who take care of orchards. Their work is also reflected in how the fruit is produced, because they're the ones who have to make sure the tree's watered properly. They're the ones who have to make sure that they do pest control. They're the ones who have to make sure other animals aren't damaging the tree and stealing fruit prematurely or whatever. It's their job. And so in a way, the nurturing does have an external force to it, but most of us as human beings, we don't think of it that way. You look at an apple tree, and the easy way of evaluating if it's any good is you take an apple and you bite into it. But at the same time, the tree itself has to also be good. You don't cut the tree and look at the branches. You don't peel parts of it and look at the tree parts itself and say, hey, I think this tree is good. No, you evaluate by its fruit. And that's why Jesus plays on that sense of logic. That makes logical sense to me. We don't once again, when you evaluate an apple tree, you don't take a part of the tree and then study it. You take an apple and you bite into it. That's the easy way of evaluating an apple tree. But here Jesus is saying that, like, yeah, you have to develop a good inner person, because if the tree is bad, then the fruit no doubt will be bad. And so that's where the interesting line of, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. And so your inner person is so important that you always keep that in check. And ultimately, you have to allow God to nurture that, because you cannot do it yourself. You can try, but you can only get so far. And trust me, how far you get on your own is never going to be good enough. It needs so much more than what you can do. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that, like, oh, do nothing and expect God to do everything. That's also kind of absurd, because that's not how God does things. He doesn't just do it. If God was going to do everything himself, then he wouldn't need any of us, right? So there's that part of it too. So I wouldn't be I don't want to be dishonest and say, like, oh, you have to let God do everything, because that's a very dishonest thing to say. That's also kind of stupid and not how God created us anyway. So, but at the same time, you have to allow God to do good nurturing, because if you try to do things yourself, you will also allow bad things to corrupt yourself pretty quickly. But one of the I know we're still like in chapter 6 and we gotta do chapter 7, but the TLDR of chapter 6, and I love this evolution when it starts from the love your enemies all the way down to the two builders. The evolution of, it starts with your actions, to be good to all people, to people who are your enemies, which is like the extreme end of, how to be good to all people. Then the evolution is from not just it can't just be your actions though, because that's not enough. You have to do it on a behavioral level, because if it doesn't start on the inside, then the outside, if you try to fake on the outside, it won't last. And if it's not good if you're not built up properly by God on the inside, it ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. And behavior is so important, and I don't think I can emphasize that enough. A funny example of, that one passage of, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. I know this sounds terrible, because like on the one hand I'm talking about a person kind of behind their back, but it's not like this person hasn't heard anything I'm going to say. And so those of you that know, I mean, you already know, and you were there when this happened. But basically, I remember I was co-hosting a stream for my buddy, and we were playing a game, and it's one of those things that, like, once again, the community itself, I mean, not to slam you guys too hard, but this is why I keep emphasizing you need to cultivate a better personality, guys. But he was playing a video game, and he referred to a woman, instead of saying like, oh, this woman, or calling her by name, he said this bitch. And I called him out on it. I was like, don't talk about people like that. And so on the one hand, it's one of those things that, like, because on streams you only see part of our lives, but this guy, I know him more offline too, and we talk quite a bit offline, so I know him more offline as well. And so I know his behaviors, and I know what he thinks about things, and I know his attitude towards certain things. And so I've called him out. I called him out then, that I was like, you need to fix your attitude towards women. And it's like a joke on all his streams that he always like simps over women, talk about like how much he likes women with large chests and everything. And not just like, okay, I'm being very polite about it, because I think it's one of those things, like a behavioral thing. I'm very polite about those things, not just because I'm not an asshole, but because, once again, I view people very valuably, and so I never talk down to people like that. I never say degrading things, especially to women, because I have a high respect. And so let's put it this way. My respect for women is a behavioral thing. It's a behavioral thing that I've developed a high respect. I mean, I always made the joke that, like, well, to be fair, I was in like a Chinese dance theater where I was 50% of the masculine population for like 8 of those years out of the 16 years I was there. So, that has a large influence. But because of that, it's a behavioral thing that I'm extremely respectful to women. And so I never say things like, I'll never refer to like a woman that way. But this friend of mine, he uses language like that all the time, and especially when he talks about women too. And so it just slips out when he just blurted it out, because that's how he talks. And that's, and I know some people are quick to defend and say, well, that's how people are, but like, I mean, hello, we're in 2022. You can get canceled for saying anything degrading about anyone. That's like, okay, about a woman, or if, like, for example, for example, like I could probably get like canceled because of some semi-political things I've said, but at the same time, I'm always very careful about how I address anyone, even with people I disagree with, because I've developed the behavior of always treating people politely, kindly, and lovingly, even the people I disagree with, even people I don't outwardly like. I will still always act good to you, because That is a behavior I've cultivated. And that's something that Jesus talks about here. You got to cultivate that behavior. Love your enemies. But in contrast, I'm using my buddy here as the contrast of myself. He uses very degrading words to women, and I always made the joke with him, like, on one hand I'm joking, but on the other hand it's like, dude, you need to fix this, or you could find yourself in serious trouble down the road. And he just blurts out stuff that's very offensive to women on air, and not just him, but other people within like the voice chat that we have, where like there's multiple of us. And there were multiple people who blurt out things like, don't talk like that. You cannot, like, don't talk like that. And I'm not just saying this as a prude, which, I mean, I'm aware that that's part of it. But on the other hand, it's like, you should talk about people, and you should talk to people better than this. You should be better than this. Especially in today's world, right, where you can get yourself in a lot of trouble for even pretty small things. Of course, once again, like, my buddy's not a big channel either, so it's not like it's going to be like instantly under the fire, right? But it's one of those things that like you have to really the behavior thing Jesus is talking about here with the good tree and the right house builders. It's so important, because the point I'm getting at with this story is that your behaviors, they will show, because they're, after all, your behaviors are your behaviors are the closest thing to the real you that people will see. And if that is not of good character, you can be in huge trouble pretty quick. Not just before God, because that's its own problem, but even before people. And going back with the judging others and measure unto others as the measure you use for others will be used to you. Wow. That's where stuff like the purity cycle, this purity spiral, comes in, and stuff like that. It's all from that idea, and all those kind of conflicts within people. I'm just gonna get rid of that. All right, I've talked enough about chapter 6, so we're gonna move on to chapter 7 and end the video with that. Chapter 7 has a lot of content in it too. But chapter 7 is a lot more stories, so I don't have to do too much teaching things in chapter 7. But we got a lot of story stuff to cover, so let's just dive right into it. Chapter 7. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, Oh, I'm gonna read that again because I burped on the mic there. Verse 2. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders to the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. Now he wasn't far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "O Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and this other one, 'Come,' and he comes. And I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." So when Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Now afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As Jesus approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. Only the son of his mother... a dead person was being carried out. The dead person, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. And Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. And they were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said, "for God has come to help his people." And this news about Jesus spread through Judea and the surrounding country. Now John the Baptist, his disciples told him about all these things. Now calling two of them, John sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to ask you, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" And at that time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." After John's messengers left, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear expensive clothes and indulge in luxury are in palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet, for this is the one whom it is written, 'I will send you my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' I tell you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he." And all the people, even tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right, because they had been baptized by John. But the Pharisees and the experts of the law rejected God's purposes for themselves, because they had not been baptized by John. So Jesus went on to say, "To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the market and calling out to each other, 'We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not cry.' For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, 'He is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is proved right by all her children." Now when one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, I guess using telepathy, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher." So two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, and the other 150. Neither of them had the money to pay him back. So he forgave both their debts. Now which of them would love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you didn't give me any water to wash my feet. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, Your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, Who is this who even forgives sins? Then Jesus said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And I think that's a great part to end off reading for chapter 7, because there's quite a bit of the last story I want to talk about, so I want to have time for that. So we're gonna go through the first part as fast as we can, maybe. Damn, it's getting worse, isn't it? I thought I was like, in the previous weeks I was like super ambitious, 3 chapters, and I found I was rushing 3 chapters. Here I am in week 3, and I had to rush 2 chapters. What's going on here? But anyway, let's just dive into this. So the first we have the story of this centurion. And this story is kind of an interesting one, because we have the centurion, Roman soldier leader, I guess. A centurion is a person who would lead 100 people. So he's like I guess hard to put like an equivalent in like today military. I guess he's like slightly above a lieutenant. What would that be? Because centurion leads 100 people. So he's not a general. I don't even think he's colonel level. I think he's a little lower than that. So he might be like a captain. Let's go with that. He's a captain of a team, or of a military unit, I guess is more accurate. He's a captain of a military unit. And apparently he's pretty popular in this Jewish community, because apparently he built them a synagogue and they love him for it, despite being a foreigner. Because normally, we read in other parts of, even in the Gospels, Jewish people here can be pretty racist. Like, they hate people who are even half-bred Jews, like the Samaritans, which we will cover them later. But I guess this Roman centurion, they love this guy, because I guess the Roman centurions he's a pretty rad dude. Anyway, the centurion has a servant that's apparently kind of sick. And of course, in the ancient world, medicine's not as easy, and people can die of even the common cold. Sickness was treated like a lot more, like, it's one of the beauties of modern technology. I always bring this up, that like one of the beauties of modern technology and modern medicine is that we have cures for a lot of things. Like, sure, we don't have cures for all the big things that are still kicking our ass now. I'm looking at you, like cancer and other heart diseases, and of course COVID. But for a lot of other diseases that have killed thousands of people in the past, we have cures for them. And so in the same way, there was probably this guy here suffering from some kind of symptom. We don't know what it was, some kind of illness. And in the ancient world, you were never sure if someone was going to survive any kind of sickness, because medicine wasn't that great for a pretty long time. Once again, like, modern medicine, like, what we consider modern medicine, which actually wasn't even started until like our concept of like medicine, our modern era of it, is actually a very, very recent phenomenon in the grand scheme of things, because I don't think our modern medicine wasn't even a thing till like the mid to late 1800s. So what we take for granted for medicine now has only been around for like 150 years. But in that 150 years, we have made gigantic strides. We are able to cure all kinds of things. Some of those things are like it's one of those things that, like, once again, I always try to say, ignore the naysayers that say, like, the time is bad or whatever. It's like, no. In human history, we live in a great time. And one of those things is that, like, we have medicines for things that have killed thousands of people in the past. But in this story, we don't have that, right? So people have to rely on miracles and stuff. And that miracles don't always happen. But here we have this centurion who believes, like, oh, this Jesus guy's here, and he's known for healing people. So I'll have him come and heal my servant, because, I want my servant healed. And even though the Bible says the centurion highly valued him, which adds to the more, like, this guy's clearly a Chad. So this centurion is clearly a Chad because he values the servant. Whereas, you think of a servant, you're thinking, oh, he's just kind of, a low-level employee, kind of whatever, right? But no, the centurion actually values him. So this mega Chad of a centurion asks, first he gets, like, the Jewish elders in the town. Says, yo, get this Jesus guy and have him heal my guy. And then Jesus goes part of the way, and then the centurion probably, like, gets word that, like, oh, Jesus actually coming to your house. And the guy's like, oh, that's not necessary. Just, and sends his friends to just tell Jesus. And the funniest part of the story is that the centurion himself never actually meets Jesus, because he sends other people to do it. And of course, it's written here that the centurion says, well, I'm not worthy to like meet you. And then Jesus is just like, wow, like, that's faith. Like, this guy is so confident that I'm going to heal his servant that he's not even willing, like, he thinks I can do it, like, from a distance. Like, that's hardcore. Because you think of, like, medicine, you have to apply medicine. Here, the centurion's thinking, like, Chadchurian? Maybe I'll call him Chadchurian for the rest of this segment. So Chadchurian thinks that, like, no, I don't even need that. Jesus can just do it because he can. And Jesus acknowledges that. He's like, yeah, okay. You believe that? That's incredible. It's because apparently no one in Israel thinks that. So I'm going to do exactly that. And that's pretty funny. And Jesus is just like, yeah, okay. Because of your faith, I will heal your servant. All right, time to do other things, I guess. And then, of course, the story ends with the servant being healed. I think I always, like, the story is pretty straightforward, but I always like to point out that, like, the centurion himself, or the Chadchurian, never actually meets Jesus, which I think is probably what makes him such a Chad. But, like, that's real faith right there. That and that's one of those things that, like, it's one of those things that Christians nowadays, we kind of just autopilot this thinking, but it was extremely profound in this story where, we believe in Jesus able to bring healing and miracles in our lives, despite not seeing him. Right? Like, we don't have a physical, like, Jesus doesn't physically appear, next to me and does stuff for me. He doesn't do that. But I know Jesus has done a lot of things in my life that is nothing short of a miracle. But I don't see him do it. But I know he does it. And I have faith that he will keep doing it as, life goes on, because, well, we need miracles from God all the time. And so it's pretty impressive here in this story that Chadchurian is like, oh yeah, you know what? I'm a man under authority. I know how giving commands works. So why don't you just command that my servant be better? Because that's all you would have to do. And that's a pretty bold statement for the centurion to make. Right? Because, if you think of the standpoint of, like, this is a centurion, a Roman centurion, the people who ruled the Jews at the time an average Roman would not think that a foreigner would have, like, there would be no weight to the word of a foreigner. That's probably what as a Roman he would think. But that's not at all what this guy thinks. It's not at all what Chadchurian thinks. Chadchurian thinks that, no, Jesus' words have power, and he just has to speak them, because that's how powerful they are. And that's pretty impressive part of the story. And so I think the fact that they never actually meet adds more to how spectacular the miracle itself is. Next, we have this weird excerpt of, I'm pretty sure it's the first. I know the book of Matthew has a couple versions of this, or like other miracles similar to this, or the same type of miracle, I guess you could say, because they're not just similar; they're the same type of miracle. They just happen to different people, and that's when Jesus raises people from the dead. Now, technically, we did have people in the Old Testament raise people from the dead, but it was never like this. And so, the first thing about the Luke passage compared to Old Testament resurrections and even the ones in the book of Matthew, one of the interesting things about Jesus raising the dead here is that it's a public display. Like, there are other people around and they see it. The only other times in the Old Testament where people are raised from the dead is when Elisha does it. Elijah does it once and Elisha does it once. And both times, it's since it's done in private, people can do all kinds of explaining away whether they actually raised someone from the dead or not. You can explain it away. But here, because it's a public display, it's just like everyone else is aware that this guy is dead, and then he lives again. Like, if there are a bunch of people there, then you have witnesses, which I think is one of the major reasons why Luke uses this account, as opposed to in the Matthew account, there's a story where Jesus enters a girl's house, and the girl's dead, and the only people that are there are Peter, James, John, and then the girl's parents. So those are like 5 people tops for witnesses. And then, of course, the girl herself, when she's back alive and all that. But here, this is apparently a public thing. And, of course, you have a bunch of these people in the public that are kind of sympathizing with this woman because they're feeling sorry for her because of how screwed she is. The widow, the mother of this dead kid. And there's a pretty big public gathering with a small mix of schadenfreude, I'm sure, because these people probably, they know how screwed this woman is with the fact that her son is dead and apparently she has no other person in her life. So in most cases, if that were to happen, and the Bible makes points of this, in like the book of Kings has a couple of examples of this, if you want to check out the Elijah and Elisha versions of this story, where we have widow women. I have a playlist on the channel. Yes, I got all of them. Did it. But basically, there were multiple cases, even in the book of Kings and even other parts of the Bible, where you would have a woman who was a widow. So her husband probably died in a war or something. Because, people fight all the time in the ancient world. So husband dead in the war. Who's left? Well, her son that she has to raise up. But if he dies, that's it. That's usually how these stories go down. And this is not just in Bible stories. You find these kind of stories in other literature. They're popular in samurai literature. And of course, in samurai literature, there's the added bit of like the samurai kind of acts like a mentor to the widow's son. That's kind of, if you watch Samurai Showdown or played the games, that definitely happens in Samurai Showdown. I think of other samurai narratives. Well, the tale of Genji obviously has it. But anyway, this idea of this widow that has like an only son, and basically if he dies, that's it. The woman is like beyond screwed when that happens, because that's how it was in ancient world. And so all these people that are gathered here, they're kind of, it's funny because they're all here, and then they also realize how screwed this woman is. But then Jesus shows up, and he restores life to this son. And on the one hand, well, he raises a guy from the dead, so that's pretty rad there. And then of course he restores the woman as well, and restores hope in her life and all that, because now she's not totally screwed. And it's interesting that this version of a resurrection incident is a public event, because then all the people, and there's an interesting contrast here, because the reason why I bring up how, the samurai reference of how screwed the woman would be if her son was in fact dead, because even though the people would have mourned with her for that moment, people would have gone back to their lives, and then people would have forgot about her. And then that's where, the beginning of the downhill of being totally screwed. Because then people would have just like, okay, well, you're on your own. Oh, wait, you have no one. So you are literally on your own and will probably not survive. other than being forced into prostitution work, which sucks. So I mean, that was basically the fate of this woman, and Jesus restores hope and life into her life as well. And once again, the story also just shows that level of compassion Jesus has for, the really downtrodden in this case, where once again it's a dead guy and his about to be totally screwed mom. But Jesus restores that. Not much else to say about this story. I think it's pretty straightforward in that sense. Moving on to Jesus and John the Baptist. And a little commentary here, not much. Basically, John the Baptist's guys are like, yo, is this Jesus guy the Messiah that you've been talking about? And Jesus kind of doesn't directly answer them. But instead of giving a simple yes or no, he just tells them that, like, well, look at these signs and you decide, is what he does. Which is interesting that Jesus does this, because I mean, the easy way would be for him to just say, yeah, I am. Discussion over. But I think the other thing too, and I think what the book of Luke does on a very clever level, is something that can be applied to not just the churches that would be, Luke would be writing this for at the time, but this can be true for all of us, even to this day, about how we approach our belief in God. Because it's one thing to just be like, Jesus, are you God? And he could be like, yeah, like, end of discussion. Believe now, right? That's certainly one way of doing things, because I'm pretty sure that is completely within Jesus' power to do. But instead, Jesus tells them, well, look around you. Look at the witnesses. You look at all the stuff being done in people's lives, and then you decide for yourself, is what Jesus is basically telling them. Tell John, this is what you see. The blind see, the deaf hear, the poor are given hope. That is what you see. So tell John that. He doesn't just give him a flat answer of like, yes, I am the Messiah. Right? He doesn't do that. And instead, he encourages them to look at all the evidence that's been happening around them of miracles and stuff like that. And this is something that, like, us as Christians, and even, to those of you who may not be Christians that are watching this, that's something that we ought to do in, well, of course, in the context of the Bible, in our faith lives, but in everyday life, right? You always take the evidence of what's happening around you, and not just in a physical world, although that's obviously duh, but you see how, like, for example, people's lives change when people who become Christians and their lives change. And that can be evidence of, like, well, God is working even to this day. I remember having, like, funny discussions with someone about how when people ask, where are the miracles? Does God still perform miracles today and stuff like that? And I was baffled by that question. I was like, what do you mean, does God perform miracles today? Of course he does. They just don't happen. I think, my opinion is that I think when many people ask that question, they're asking the wrong question. When someone says, does God still do miracles? They're thinking of, like, God, making 7-year droughts and then, like, defying nature that way. Or maybe people think, like, oh, there's this guy with, like, a missing arm. Is God going to magically regenerate that arm? Right? Or stuff like that. And that's when people say, like, well, does God still do miracles like that? Because, I mean, that does happen in the Bible, right? There are people that are, like, cured of deadly diseases and whatever. And then, of course, some people think God doesn't do miracles today because people still suffer from deadly diseases today, just like they have been through the rest of human history. But when I was like, well, of course God performs miracles, because one of the greatest miracles is God changing a person's life. And I mean, I've mentioned this before. One of my role models in life was, like, a former gangster, and straight up like has shot people and other terrible things like that. He's done pretty bad things in his life. But you know, he's done a complete 180. He's changed totally. He's not that, you know, thuggish gangster anymore. He's a loving husband. He's a good father. He's a powerful man of God. He does all kinds of ministry and stuff like that. And you would never think that they were the same person, but they were once upon a time the same guy. And the miracle was that God changed this hardened, you know, thug, gangster to a powerful preacher. And then of course, you know, the Bible has its own version of this guy, you know, like Paul, you know, St. Paul, right? This idea of like, well, God can change the most hard-hearted people. That's a miracle. That's a huge miracle. That's a far greater miracle than magically restoring a guy's arm. Because for all we know, that guy might do the same stupid thing and lose the arm again. But to change a person's heart completely like that, well, that's a real miracle. But anyway, I was like, why was I talking about this again? But anyway, it goes back with when Jesus tells John's disciples, well, what do you see? You see the blind seeing. You see people being changed. You see the work of God in people's lives. So you decide for yourself if Jesus is the Messiah, is what Jesus is telling John's disciples. And that's something that also Jesus encourages all of us today. Even as, you know, in 2022. You know, look at the evidence around you. See how God changes people's lives. See how God brings healing in people's lives. Restores relationships, restores people's health. You know, other things like that. And God restores people. God brings hope to people. Yada, yada, yada. Well, then you look around, you meet people that have had these transformations, and you decide for yourself. Which once again is a very Christian idea. That once again you decide for yourself, because unlike, say, Judaism or a lot of ancient religions, you're not born into a religion. In ancient worldviews, you were born into a religion. In Christianity, you're not. But of course, what Jesus encourages people to do is to be a follower of Jesus. Well, look at what he does, and then you decide if you believe. And so there's also that whole, like, God gives us free will in that sense. You're not forced to be a Christian in that sense. But at the same time, Jesus is like, look, man, I've done... Of course, like, when you get to the end of, like, the Gospels, Jesus is like, look, man, I've done so much. How much more can I possibly do? But in this earlier passage, Jesus has this more, like, he's inspiring that sense of wonder in people. Be like, well, look for yourself. You see, like, how much I'm doing. You decide for yourself. And that's something I encourage for all of us as well. It's like, well, you decide. You look at the lives of people. You look at your own life and see where God has acted in it. And you decide for yourself, you know, if Jesus is the Messiah or not, based on what he's doing in your life. And of course, you know, in a more literal sense, in the book of Luke, well, the book of Luke is saying, well, look at all this stuff that's going on with Jesus' actions. Right? And based on everything he's been doing, well, what do you think after, you know, in this case, as Luke writes about it, he's probably saying, well, after all this you've read, and people can attest that Jesus did this, well, what do you think? What do you think? And I think that's a very interesting way that Jesus responds to that question. Well, are you the one we've been waiting for? Well, you decide that based on what you see. Even though the evidence is pretty clear that, like, yeah, Jesus is like, yeah, I clearly am. Look at what I'm doing. I'm doing stuff only the Messiah can do. And, you know, it goes back to those Son of Man passages that I talk about. But we'll skip that for now because I want to move on to the last part of the story, which this could be its own lecture. I could spend a whole stream on this last story, but we'll talk about this one. So, Jesus anointed by a sinful woman is what the Bible captures as part of that. Because I have to divide it by stories, right? Because each chapter has so many different ones in it. But basically, there's a story where Jesus goes to this guy's, another Simon, because, you know, I've made this joke so many times. Ancient world people suck at naming kids. There's always at least a junior. And of course, everybody has the same name, so there's like everywhere, like no doubt, there's gonna be like a bunch of Simons. There's a bunch of Marys too, and the Bible is notorious for that. But anyway, we got this dude named Simon, not Simon Peter, and not Simon the Zealot either, but another Simon that invites Jesus to his house, have dinner, maybe have some debates, because that's what rabbis do. They love having their philosophical debates, and I like that too. So anyway, Jesus invited this guy's house, probably to have dinner and have philosophy debates. And while Jesus is there, this woman shows up, who apparently lived a sinful life. But let's be real, we all know what the Bible is talking about. Like, it's not that subtle, okay? And she basically, and of course, once again, the Bible also gives you a lot of clues, if in case you're denser than a black hole and you don't know what the Bible is talking about. Well, the Bible kind of spells it out for you. And that's the kind of the fun part I want to talk about, how like we know that this woman was obviously a prostitute. But anyway, before we get into the fun literary side bits, I just want to talk about the message of this part of the story, because I think it's super, super important. And it goes back to like the fundamentals of Christianity, and I've mentioned it already, talk about my role model and St. Paul and all that. And it's the parable about two people owing their master money, and 500 denarii. A denarii is basically a day's wages. So what would that be in today's terms? If you say like, let's say I make $100 a day, roughly, in a full day's work. So that's how much a denarii would be, roughly. So if this is 500 denarii, well, 500 times 100 would be $50,000. And so let's say there was a guy who owed someone $50,000 and another person who only owed $5,000. And then Jesus was saying, well, if the person absolved both debts, well, who would be more grateful? Well, obviously, the guy who owed the $50,000 as opposed to the $5,000, right? And there, Jesus makes his point that, like, well, this woman, even though apparently she's this great sinner, because of course, even Simon himself points out, which there's questions about that too. How does Simon know that this woman is a prostitute? That brings up questions. So, because if he's supposed to be Mr. Upright here, he wouldn't associate with people like that, and even people who would have that knowledge that this woman was a prostitute, if he's so upright. So that brings questions about this guy, right? But of course, once again, the point that the Bible makes is that, well, you can't be too strict on judgment on people, because you're really not that different. And that's another reason why the Bible says, well, you can't judge people, because it's not because judging itself is wrong, but it's because the danger of hypocrisy in the reality that you're really not that different from the people you judge. But of course, with that said, my as I would tell you, that's all the more reason we need Jesus in our lives, because then we are quick to do things like judge each other, despite the fact we're also pretty bad ourselves. But that's the reason why we all need Jesus, to all be freed from that, and from that condemnation from each other as well as ourselves. But anyway, so Jesus basically is saying, like, well, this woman, she's here showing me devotion, and she's showing me great love, because she wants to be forgiven. And then Jesus at the end of the story says, well, your faith has saved you. Your sins are forgiven, your faith has saved you, go in peace. Which, once again, this is where the extremity of forgiveness kind of plays out. And I mentioned this with the forgiveness paradox. And once again, some people say, well, forgiveness should be easy. But in actuality, it's not, especially when you consider some things that people need to be forgiven of. Now, of course, we can be pretty lenient towards, say, a prostitute, because a lot of it might be because she had to. So you can't, like, on the one hand, it's like, okay, having sex with multiple men is a sin. But at the same time, well, unfortunately, she kind of had to, because It's either that or die. So, I mean, it's when you gotta deal with a crappy ultimatum like that, you can be lenient, right? And that's also how we view it today. So say like, okay, prostitution is a it's a sinful thing, but at the same time, you're pretty lenient towards them. You're not gonna be like harsh and be like you're a terrible person because you're a prostitute. Like no, right? Like don't be ridiculous. Most women in that position are forced there by asshole men. So it's really on them, right? Evil men that need to be punished, and would we would say deserve hellfire kind of people. But a woman like this, a lot of it might have been forced. It can't be hell. It's how terrible life is. And I it is so terrible I'm doing this now. But the word pun of like the widow that's about to be totally screwed in life. I mean, all puns intended. Coming back to that story, right? Because a woman like that would have been forced, and this woman could have been no different. And so there's a if we go with that analogy once again, this is not one to one because the Bible never tells us where this woman comes from, the one we're talking about now. We don't know if that happened to her, but it's safe to assume something like that could have happened, which is why she may have been forced into prostitution. The Bible doesn't tell us whether she was forced into it or whether she deliberately chose it. We don't know. The Bible never tells us. But what we do know is that since she was a prostitute, and the Bible gives a lot of clear reasons to think that that was definitely the case, you have Simon being extremely judgmental. And he's like, well, look at this filthy woman touching this rabbi. If Jesus knew what kind of woman she was, he wouldn't allow this. Now, of course, there's also the element that Jesus is breaking taboos, that the Messiah is for all people. And so even this prostitute can receive forgiveness from the Messiah, right? That's how that's the power of God's forgiveness. Of course, once again, we'll see even worse people get forgiven by God. But and we already have seen worse people be forgiven by God. Going back to the book of Samuel, got a playlist, check it out. But like David did something way worse than what this prostitute has ever done. So, and yet God forgives him. And so it's interesting that we have this, Simon here being extremely close-minded and extremely judgmental. And then, of course, Jesus correctly rebukes him and correctly, tells him that, like, no, for God has come to forgive all people, and even, people who've committed great sin. But at the same time, the story of the $50,000 and the $5,000 debt forgiveness is that, like, well, of course, this woman would act the way that she does if she wants to be saved. Because if she has a lot to answer for before God, she knows she must do much to be forgiven, and she has done that. And so that's why Jesus says to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, I always find this story kind of interesting, and this is where one of those like nerdy moments. So bear with me as we I know I'm going a little bit over time here, but damn, like these two chapters so rich in content, right? And this little dissecting this part of the story is a little fun because I always found this kind of interesting about this dynamic between Jesus and this prostitute. Say that out loud 10 times in a sentence at church. But anyway, so we know this woman is a prostitute because of what she does. Now, for those of you uninitiated in how ancient world Jews, I guess, ate, well, back then, you didn't really sit on a chair and a table. That's not how people typically ate food. People technically, what they did is they would kind of lie down around the table, because I guess they didn't use chairs, they just had a bunch of cushions and lied on it. And so your feet would be facing away from the table, obviously, and then everyone's kind of leaned in, on the table, and they can talk to each other and talk philosophy and all that stuff. That's what people do. So when the Bible points out that the woman is behind him at his feet. That's what it's getting at. So there's that. Now, this is interesting that she's behind him at his feet. There's one, the woman acknowledging that she herself is unworthy because she sticks with going to his feet. But if you pay attention to what she's doing, you actually notice something that's a big inversion of something that would traditionally happen in Jewish life. And I'll use that wording for now until I get into the specificity of that. So basically, this woman is at his feet and she breaks an alabaster jar. Now, for those of you who don't know how alabaster jars work, what an alabaster functions in Jewish culture, Middle Eastern culture in general, Muslims do this too. An alabaster jar is broken on a wedding night, and you know exactly where I'm going with this. An alabaster jar is typically broken on a wedding night. And what a wife usually does on the night of the wedding is she takes an alabaster jar and she breaks it over her husband's head. And then it would drip all over his body. And this is where, yes, we can make the joke now. She is literally oiling him up, is what she's doing. That's what a typical Jewish or Arab, but it's translated to Muslim religion, so we'll say in Muslim life too. This is a typical thing that a Jewish or Muslim wife would do. She would break an alabaster jar and she would literally oil up her husband. Quite literally. And so, for the TLDR, alabaster jar is part of the foreplay. And this is meant to be treated like a sacred act. And this is where, once again, in both, and this is not, in Jewish and Muslim thinking, this is why, the sex outside of marriage is forbidden. Because once again, there's supposed to be this very ritualized aspect to sexual relations that happens on a marriage night kind of thing. And the breaking of the alabaster jar is part of that ritual. And so when the Bible points out that this prostitute has this alabaster jar, she is doing something that as a prostitute, she might have already done, because some guys would demand that from their prostitutes. Kind of have the whole rent a girlfriend kind of thing. And even though she's a prostitute, she would act for the sake of the one night stand period. She would do wifely rituals. And so she's doing something that she's doing an inversion of something that would be considered sacred in a marriage ceremony, consummation, and then she subverts it because she also views herself as being clearly unworthy because of the fact that probably she's done alabaster jars with unworthy men. So there's this interesting contrast between, okay, Jesus being the epitome of worthiness, being God and all, then there's her viewing herself as unworthy. So she can't face Jesus who's worthy, because she herself is unworthy. But then she does something that's a subversion. So she does something that would be an unworthy act, if you will, to someone who is worthy, because she doesn't want to associate the worthy act that she's probably done for unworthy men. I know that's very weirdly worded, but just roll with me here. And so once again, going back to the alabaster jar and the way that she breaks it at his feet, there's this interesting kind of poetry being played out in, when you consider all that. And of course, with that being said, that's how we know she's a prostitute. we know for a fact at this point. Then Jesus brings up what Simon didn't do. So first Simon goes, Jesus reads his mind, Jesus having telepathy and all that. He reads his mind, where Simon thinks well, if Jesus knows what kind of woman this is, which, from a literary standpoint, this is interesting that Simon thinks this, because you, the reader, should be thinking, how does Simon know this? How does Simon know she's a prostitute? Because if he was Mr. Upright, he's supposed to be, he wouldn't associate with people who would even, he wouldn't even associate with the people that would know she was a prostitute. So he himself, if he shouldn't be associated with those kind of people, he himself shouldn't know, unless, there's a lot of questions asked about that. Simon, you're a shifty one. But then Jesus correctly points out everything wrong with his thinking. So Jesus first points out, well, look at all the stuff you were supposed to do as, the host of this, our little hangout, I guess you could say. And so Jesus points out some things that would be a custom in Middle Eastern culture. Not just Jews do this, Muslims do this too. If someone enters your house, you got to give them a wet cloth or something to wipe themselves. You think of like, it's one of those things that like as a kid you kind of think is like kind of funny, somewhat unrelated note. But if you go to a Japanese restaurant, they always give you a hot wet towel, and actually a part of that, there's the obvious cleaning, like wiping your hands before you eat, because you should always wipe your hands before you eat. But in a lot of ancient cultures, that whole wet cloth thing, Japanese do it, Japanese people do it, Chinese people do it, Indian people do it, Middle Eastern people do it. They all do it. All these Eastern cultures do it, and they wipe themselves with a wet cloth as part of a cleaning ritual. One, because, and of course, it's one of those things that like over time it got spiritualized. Of the modern explanation would just be like, well, it's hygiene, right? You should just wipe your hands with a with a clean wet towel. Excuse me. You should wipe yourself with a clean wet towel before you eat. That's just common sense. But in the ancient world, it was also treated with like a religious ritual. Part of it was also to help them habituate it. But that's besides the point. The point is that Jewish custom, Muslim custom, other cultures do it too. Jesus points out, hey, Simon, you didn't leave me water to wash myself when I came into your house. So Jesus points out something Simon didn't do. And then Jesus points out, well, this woman has used her tears to wipe my feet. And then Jesus says, well, you didn't give me a kiss. The Italian thing, kiss on each side of a person's cheek kind of thing. No homo. People just did this because, once again, it's a greeting, how you greet those that are important to you. You greet your family and your friends. You might not treat a stranger this way, but you treat all your friends, even like habitual acquaintances. Like that's how important this was. And when I say habitual acquaintance, I mean like maybe like a coworker or something. We don't do this in North America, obviously. And even before COVID, I'm not even going to bring up COVID as why we don't do it. But even before COVID, like we don't do that in North America. So it's not part of, Canadian or American culture to like you don't go to work and then kiss all your coworkers saying like, oh, I hope you're great, like good morning, kiss, right? Like we don't do that. But when you go to someone's house, you're supposed to. Even if they're like, well, I use the coworker thing. Like, for example, if your coworker comes to your house, you're supposed to treat them that way. Like you treat them as if they're family. And you would give your family a kiss. That's kind of what Jesus is pointing out here. You didn't do that, right? So the cleansing ritual, you didn't do. You didn't treat me like a proper guest. And then Jesus adds a third element, which you would not typically find in Jewish custom. And that's when Jesus points out you didn't put oil on my head. And so in Jewish custom, the idea of putting oil on someone's head, and Christians practice this to an extent today, was the idea that like the idea of like, oh, I know you may have had some rough stuff in your life, but God blesses you. And God is good to you, and you can be viewed as good and holy. Even if you may have sinned during the week and did some mistakes in your life in the week or whatever. And in church, in a Sunday church, that's what the anointing of oil kind of represents, right? That God has forgiven you in that sense, and as a week to week thing. And so, if the Simon, who's supposed to be Mr. Upright, he would give that blessing to someone if he thought they were, in need of correcting, which may have been a reason why Simon invited Jesus to his house, that they would have philosophical debates, and maybe Simon would think to himself, I'm going to correct this Jesus. But clearly he didn't really think that either, because he didn't anoint Jesus with oil. And Jesus points out, you didn't give me oil. Like, you didn't do anything that you should have done as Mr. Upright here, is what Jesus is kind of pointing out. And I know a lot of people use this passage also pointing that, like, this is why Jesus hates the religious types, because the religious act upright even though they don't act it, which is true to an extent. And so Jesus, this story is an example of that, where Jesus points out, like, to Simon, you didn't do anything that a person of your stature was supposed to do. You didn't do any of that. But then now we have this prostitute who, in her miserable attempt, if you will, of treating, oddly enough, this is a weird thing to say out loud too, when Jesus acknowledges that a prostitute treats him like a husband, even though the righteous person treats him like garbage. So I guess see, this is where the poetry kind of plays out in this story, is that and once again, Jesus' inversion of the expectation of the Messiah comes into play. The treasure, the valuable one, treats Jesus like trash, but the trash treats Jesus like treasure. And so Jesus acknowledges this, and then Jesus points out, this is what has saved you, to the woman. He points out that, like, you are forgiven because you've believed who I am, and you've treated me accordingly. Treating Jesus as he should be treated, with the respect and dignity of God. But Simon does not at all do this, whereas a lowly prostitute does. And that's the poetry of this story. And I think that's why this story is actually, it's one of those stories that, like, obviously it's kind of hard to tell this one in a Sunday school, because how else do you explain it? Like, yeah, like a prostitute comes in and gives Jesus a little foot bath. That's a weird that's a weird way to title it, but that's what I'm calling it now. So, I mean, I love to see how Sunday schools do that with kids. I don't remember learning that one as a kid. We usually stay away from those dirtier stories, you know what I mean? But going back with, the interest, this story, and I don't mind going over it again in a future stream. Maybe we'll talk about it more in a podcast, for example. We'll talk about this poetry of, even trashy people like us, we can be made right when we acknowledge who Jesus is. And that's what this woman does. And, that's a typical thing that shows up in church sermons when they preach about this passage. So what I'm saying is nothing particularly new. I just like to point out the whole funny thing about the marriage ritual that's actually being subverted in this scene with the prostitute and Jesus, because she subverts a marriage ritual. And the quite literal, yes, I know now I can't make you unhear it now. So to end this stream, I'm just gonna bring up the whole, the oil, the Jewish ritual of women literally oiling up their man. It's a real thing. I'm not making that up. And it's great. I'm sure it's great. But anyway, and of course the funny part of the story is that the woman subverts that ritual, because she clearly is unworthy of such a thing if she herself views herself as a dirty person, being a prostitute and all. But Jesus says, no, your faith has saved you, and that is greater than any of that other stuff. But holy moly, it's already 5:55, so we're just gonna do a bit of housekeeping. Housekeeping, and then we'll end the stream. No time for questions today, because I did go way over. Like, And there's only 2 chapters, but I mean, to be fair, chapters this story alone with the woman cleaning Jesus' feet could have been its own stream. That's how much I could talk about it, but I'm not going to because this is going to be the end of the stream. But before that, just a reminder: Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time, we have our Streaming Parson podcast. So come hang out for that. Hope you guys. Anyway, with that, this is going to be the end of the stream. The other stuff of the week, I'll just bring them up on Monday because we are running out of time now. But Monday, 4 o'clock Pacific time, podcast is back. So, with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Luke with me. I pray that maybe you learned something, minus the whole oiling up thing. Please let that not be the only thing you learn from me today. But I hope you learned something. Hope you guys have a great Friday night, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. I will see you guys on Monday for the podcast. God bless you, and have a good one.